Cool. Hello, everyone. If you could drop in the chat where you're calling in from and what organization you are a part of, we'd love to have you do that. Again, in the chat on organization and what part of the country you're calling in from. I'm in snowy Vermont. You probably can't see it, but it's been beautiful big flakes all day long here in snowy Vermont. And it's lovely to see some awesome old friends.
So would
Hey,
you be
Tony.
able, if I ordered them right now and just got on Bunch Breeders, would you be able to get?
Uh, hey, Mom. Hey, Annie. Lots of great folks here. If you can mute yourself and then drop in the chat where you're calling in from, thanks. Okay, we're gonna get started. I'm so excited for this conversation. Mallory is someone I've gotten to know over the past couple of years, and I just really admire you and the way you approach the work. In my mind, there's not a lot of people that can balance kind of big ideas and big thinking and disruptive ideas, and then also figure out how to create the institutions to bring those ideas to life. And you've done that through your career. So I'm super excited to dig in with you. For those of you I don't know, my name is James, and I run Willow Education. I'm a recovering K-12 school administrator and executive. And now I run Willow Education, which is a student success platform. Specifically, we help high schoolers navigate discovering their purpose and what they might want to do next in their life, and help them find economic and social mobility in their lives. Mallory, I'm going to embarrass you and read your bio because it's so impressive, and then we can jump in. One of my norms is like webinars too often are boring. So let's make this not boring because you jump in with questions and come off mute and be part of a conversation. So Mallory, you're today the executive director of Craft Education, a nonprofit division of Western Governors University that's developing the ecosystem platform to enable work-based pathways across higher ed in the workforce. You've devoted your career to merging education with tech innovation. Your work streamlines regulatory data, addresses labor shortages, unlocks opportunities for working learners, and provides real-time talent solutions for businesses. You began as a Spanish teacher at TFA, Teach for America, and later co-founded a public charter school in the San Francisco Bay Area. Then you co-founded Reach University, an apprenticeship-based university that helps hundreds of school districts grow their own teachers. You graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern with a BA in economics, Spanish, and international studies. Additionally, have a PhD in education from Oxford, with a focus on rural teacher shortages, which you attended as a U.S. Rhodes Scholar, and an MBA from Harvard Business School. Is that all?
I think, well, I've got a daughter who's, whooping me. Whatever I've done anywhere else, I'm losing that battle. So other than that, I think you're up to speed.
Remind me how old your daughter is?
Ellie Lewis too.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's a good age to be whooped on a bit.
So I'm learning. Yeah.
So I'd love to just walk us through your journey a bit, from the classroom and then to Reach, and how have you gotten into this world of apprenticeships and apprenticeship degrees?
Absolutely. And by the way, I'm going to pick on a few people as I do that. Catherine Haley and Tony Lewis in particular. I'm looking at you, though there's about a million other people in here. Chelsea amongst them, Chelsea Miller. Like I'm seeing a lot of familiar faces here who I think should be chiming in on this. So I am picking on you all. I'm going to put you on the spot. So this is your warning. It is so nice to see so many smart, brilliant people here today and to really get to have a great conversation all together. As the journey kind of outlined there, started as an academic researcher, then became a classroom teacher. And everything that has come from since has been sort of pulling on the threads that bothered me in those two experiences. First, researching teacher shortages, and then living the teaching experience as a TFA core member. And it actually started with Tony Lewis. So I was sitting at a breakfast for the Philanthropy Roundtable in 2016, I want to say, before the charter school had been opened, where I'd been fundraising for this idea of a charter school that would have a teacher training program attached to it, based on doctoral research that I'd done. And everybody thought it was bonkers, right? Like nobody was interested. It was a lot of time spent trying to get anyone to talk with me. But fortunately, people like Catherine Haley and Tony Lewis were part of that work at the Philanthropy Roundtable. And in particular, I sat with Tony one breakfast. And Tony, I'm going to talk way too much today. So I wonder if you want to tell that part of the story of like where this all started at breakfast almost a decade ago.
Yes, let's do it. You got to come off mute.
I'll come off mute, but I think you have a much better take on it, Catherine, Mallory, than I do, because I was just so impressed with your passion and insight and desire to take some risk. And that's, for me, that was even more important than the actual content of what you were trying to do. Here's a person that I wanted to invest in because you had a clear vision of what you wanted to do. It was risky. And that's something philanthropy doesn't do well, is invest in risky operations. And I wanted to. So,
Well, I paid him $5 to say that, but
and it wasn't risky because you're so good and so committed that you made it happen.
no, it really was risky. And I think like James falling short of just repeating the same journey over and over again, I'll sum it up thematically as this is there was a lot of pressure in first starting out to converge into well-grooved paths, right? There was a way to start up a charter school. There was a way to do teacher prep. And there's nothing wrong with those. It's just that in my mind, those parts of the market were saturated and that wasn't what I was coming to test. And a good piece of advice I got in early days was, look, the people who don't believe in you, there's nothing you're going to do to change their mind. Compromising on who and what you are is going to just winnow out the people who would support the exciting thing you are about by diluting what that is. And so I think that was it. From the early days, my thesis was there is a way to grow our own teachers that is good for schools in the near term, good for the teacher supply in the long term, and that creates a win-win for everybody. And it was risky. It was crazy. Catherine, I know you were one of the other early people who helped move that along, and Catherine is now the board chair for the Arizona State Department of Ed, or for the Arizona school system. And Catherine, I don't know if you want to talk about it from your lens too, but it was a very risky bet from the beginning.
I think that thanks for putting us on the spot.
Uh-huh.
I think when one of your mentors Alan Marty, brought you to an event that I happened to be at, and I think what I love, you sort of made apprenticeships and education cool before it became more readily known. More states are adopting the apprenticeship model for educators, over the last number of years. Tennessee has made a huge effort into that. I think other states like Indiana, Arizona just was approved to have a teacher apprenticeship. But I think what I loved is you're like, let's think about this differently. Let's think about how we have individuals who might be passionate about education, but they don't see how they can get there, either because they felt that they were not successful in traditional K through 12 school, or maybe they had a stint in a post-secondary program, but due to life experiences, they weren't able to complete. So it seemed like an untenable proposition for them. I think what you did hey, you love working with kids. You're passionate about learning. You're passionate about inspiring the next generation. Let's give you the tools to be able to do that in a way that sort of reduces certain barriers that might be in other communities. I also loved that you started to think about rural communities and how, again, yeah, we have a lot of online post-secondary options, but being able to do that in the context of becoming an educator, a highly qualified educator, I think, again, you sort of turned it on the head. And so anyway, I think in the role at the time, I was working for the Philanthropy Roundtable, and our job was to help identify new and interesting things that philanthropists could invest in to create those proof points. And so I think for us, we just were like, yeah, why not? And this is a huge opportunity for philanthropy to invest in. And looking at where you are today and what Reach University became and the work that you continue to do, you created those proof points that are now available in some ways at scale in a way that perhaps maybe you didn't even think about. So it's a joy. It's great to, James, well done in getting Mallory to be a part of this conversation.
I paid her $10, so there you go.
And Catherine, you're so articulate. It's so nice to hear that. And I would double down on the rural part. So for me, one of the pieces that I saw early on was, Mallory, you wanting to work in super rural, frontier rural places, right? Where they're looking for one or two teachers and they haven't had them for 10 or 12
Mhm.
years, because the rural communities are pretty good innovators, actually, and they're willing to take some risks, and nobody else is reaching out to them. And I think that was a piece of it that really appealed to us as well.
James, I got to tell a funny story before we go to
Please.
the next part of this, which is so, like Tony and Catherine mentioned, rural is my focus area. My
Mhm.
grandparents were the ones who sort of like were my home base as a kid. My parents had a lot of instability. And so I grew up most of my time with my grandparents in a rural town of about 300 people. And when I went and did my research on teacher shortages and everything else, it was overwhelmingly urban centric. And it's not to say that there aren't urban needs, but what bothered me was there are almost as many in urban as in rural areas. Actually, in the Deep South and the Great West, where I was doing my focus research, there were more kids of color in those rural communities than in those urban counterparts.
Mhm.
And yet, 90% of all teacher shortage research work, dollars, et cetera, was going to urban areas and not rural. And so that was sort of one of the hills that I was going to die on, that this is what we're about. I know this is not an area people are talking about, and many people weren't talking about it. And one of the ways that it got started is Tony Lewis rented a car. Like I finally found someone who was cared enough to talk about rural. And we brought along a couple other folks, and Tony rented a car, and we did a like 4-day ride around rural Colorado to towns where the whole K-12 school might have 20 kids in it, K through
Mhm.
12. And to just give people this understanding of, look, what we're talking about here, it can work anywhere. Apprenticeship degrees can work anywhere. But if you don't make apprenticeship degrees happen, there's nothing else that's going to touch it here. This is it. And I think, in those early days when you're starting out with an idea, it, I'm sure, felt like a mad proposition to people to go spend 4 days driving around in a car with strangers, to go stay in places where like there wasn't a hotel, there wasn't even a stoplight, let alone a hotel within 100 miles of the place. But it was how I think we first got people to the table. So, I mean, when I say that like we're only here because of some of the people in this room, I can point to very concrete 4-day long stretches like that are what made that possible.
I resonate with so much of that. Tony knows he was the second person ever to say yes to me and my crazy idea of starting Rocky Mountain Prep. And I spent too much time for his pleasure in his office at DK Foundation. Um, and now I'm just instead of paying him $5 though, he's on my shit list because he did not invite me on the 4-day road trip with you, and it took me until what 2021 to connect with you and get on the same page with your work.
Make him pay you $5. We'll
Exactly.
call it.
Yeah, yeah. That
Yeah.
$5 is coming straight through. Um,
There,
so love that. I don't know that everyone is as deeply familiar with Reach and the charter school model that I think effectively tested out the concept. You want to just describe that?
yeah. So first of all, I should say I see Brett Gottlieb has a friendship alumni banner up here. I pick on everyone. So if you're in here, good luck at Godspeed. I started out as a Teacher for America Corps member in friendship in DC. Like that's where I was
Oh,
teaching
way.
inside.
That's
Stop
awesome.
it.
There you go. So small world.
Where?
There we go,
Which,
Brett. So huge fan of y'all and the work you're doing.
that's so cool.
And so that was, where I started with this idea of, okay, charter schools is an opportunity to really innovate on something different. And the something different for me was combining work and learning for both the students and the adults themselves. This grow your own model had had a ton of potential in the research that I'd done in my doctoral research. And what the charter school, which is still running today, is about to have its 8th graduating class, believe it or not, is like the work that they focus on is helping connect those two things for both the students and the learner, the adults. So the students spend up to 50% of their time out in the real world, then come back and connect it to academics on campus through the Oxford tutorial method, which is why the name. And as we were doing that, the student population is overwhelmingly newcomer. It's a small student body, about 100 kids, almost it's certainly majority, but almost like exclusively newcomers from Central America, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras. And what the research shows very clearly is that students who have had the lived experience of being an immigrant and first generation, but maybe also being a refugee, maybe having severe trauma in terms of what led them here, and then also having major gaps in their education, like maybe haven't had formal education in any language for years, if ever. The research is really clear. Adults who've had that lived experience get accelerative academic impacts for those kids. And we had those adults working in our building, but we couldn't turn them into teachers because even in the alternative certification world, you had to have a college degree before you could enter one of those programs. And when we would try to send students, this was in California. California has a great community college system. We would send our adult learners who were working in our building in those frontline roles. We wanted their job to also be like 50% on the job, 50% academic research. And when we would send our students over, our adults over to the community college, one by one, they would drop out for reasons that had nothing to do with will or skill, right? It was, I don't have a car, and to take the bus to get there is a 2.5 hour commitment each way. I have kids and there's no childcare. Like they're offering classes at 10 a.m. on Tuesdays, and that's when I'm supposed to be here working. And so the idea of an apprenticeship degree emerged out of that. And we've consolidated it into 5 pillars, which I'll run through really quickly, that are, yes, being used at Reach, and Reach University was the university that we founded out of that, but it's certainly not exclusive. By the time Craft was acquired by Western Governors University, there were about 20 institutions using the Craft platform and to manage their teaching apprenticeships, and many more doing great work. One of them who I see here I want to pick on is Liz Qualman out in Colorado. It's also the work that we're seeing happen with the opportunity that we see here at Western Governors. And I see Kim Estep is on here, and I'll probably pick on her too. So Liz and Kim, you're the new ones on the hot seat here. But those 5 pillars really briefly before I turn to them. And these are not 5 pillars that Reach came up with. This is when we would come together and convene with other groups thinking about teaching apprenticeships and talking about what's the commonalities. These are sort of the 5 things that we set up in quality standards that we still use to this day when Reach or Craft or anyone else works on technical assistance. And the first one is efficiency. So 50% of the job should come, or of credit should come from the job itself. Working as a paraprofessional, as a classroom aide, so that you can work full time, go to school full time, still graduate in the normal course of practice. That's one. Number 2 is flexibility. So kind of going back to those reasons why students were dropping out of the program, there's sort of 3 subcomponents to this, and it's no needing childcare, no needing private transportation, and no having to miss work, right? Those are the 3 things that mean you've achieved flexibility. The third one is relevance. So if you're spending 50% of your time towards this degree working in the classroom, when you go in and take the other 50% of classes, whether that's online, in person, asynchronous, whatever it is, you should be directly connecting that to those academic studies with professors who are skilled in doing that exact work and have experience doing this work on the job. Number 4 is affordability. So my general rough view I've gotten to is any program that can get their sticker cost to $8,000 or less. I can guarantee them that we will be able to braid together Pell plus WIOA if they're thoughtful in this process, such that there never needs to be a cost of more than $75 per month to the learner. So this idea of a learner is getting paid the entire time they're working because they're working as a paraprofessional. And if they're paying anything at all, it's under $1,000 a year. That's the 4th component. And the 5th and final component of an apprenticeship degree is what we call professional capital. And what I mean by that is, let's juxtapose what it's not. In a traditional program, I will go and I will get my English teaching credential, and then I will go to a local school and say, hey, I'm here to be an English teacher. I heard you guys had teacher shortages. And a lot of times what they'll say is, we do, but not for English teachers. We have it for math teachers or special education or whatever it might be. Professional capital is this idea of have the school say, these are the vacancies I have. These are the individuals in my school working as paras, as classroom aides, as whatever, who I know would fill those exact vacancies well, and we're going to upskill them. So those individuals know there's a job waiting for them in the community where they already live, in the building where they already work, the day they graduate. So those are the 5 pillars. And again, this is not one specific institution doing this, but I will speak to Reach University, where I was until this September. The results when those 5 things are combined is pretty remarkable for us. And these are not unique things. We're seeing others get the same results. Reach's teaching apprentice population, 90% identified as some intersection of low income, working adults, people of color, and or parents, right? Like those are usually the 4 horsemen of not graduating college. And what we saw was that those students, when we got all 5 of those things right, We're graduating at higher rates, on-time graduation rates, than middle and high income white students going through traditional teacher prep programs. So we know this gets great results. It was not a compromise on quality because meanwhile we were seeing them get passes and praxis rates at the same rates. We were seeing them get similar or higher performance scores from schools in their first jobs. We were seeing them get retained better and more effectively. When we get these apprenticeship fundamentals right, the results are mind-blowing and they erase the things that we have assumed to be true for a long time. I would love to put Liz on the spot because Liz is really leading the charge out in rural Colorado, place close to my heart, clearly, as Tony and I have discussed already. But Liz is doing some great work as well. And Liz, I'm not sure if there's anything you'd want to add when you think about apprenticeship degrees.
I think the pillars that you just described, Mallory, are super important. And now you have my brain thinking about like, are we doing? We're doing most of them. And so the affordability piece is huge. The onboarding, and we're starting to now research like how apprentices in registered teacher apprentices are different than our other two pathways of traditional and alternative in how we support them. Like we can recruit them, we can get them enrolled in classes. They are working full time for their employers who are our partners in this work. But they are a very different kind of student that we're even starting to dig deeper. Like what other supports are we not thinking about to get them across the finish line? Because the four horsemen you brought up are a big deal and we are very similar in our demographics. And, a traditional student knows they're going to college. So they're planning on it, right? And an alternative candidate already has a college degree. So they've proven they can do this and take more courses to be a teacher. But apprentices may have some college, no college, and they're working full time. So it's a little different in how we think about supporting them to get them across the finish line, get the credential that they want. And they really want the credential. That's another thing about the population that's exciting is they are so committed to doing this and this opportunity that's been presented. We just want to make sure they get there.
And I think Liz is being really humble and saying something that is true for all of us. Is what I've just talked about are the 5 pillars at their maximum level, right? I don't think anyone is where they could be or should be on all 5 of those pillars. And in fact, I can put in the chat the standards that we came up with in one of our trips where institutions, we'd all go out to Oxford and all sort of like brainstorm and work on this together. Where it starts at, there's sort of 5 levels for each of the 5 indicators of where does it mean to be at the first level and how do you work your way up? And I think what's important to know and what we're constantly talking to institutions about is you don't have to start with all or nothing. Start today. And I might at some point, though, James, I realize I'm rambling too much, so I might save it for a little bit. Kim and I might talk about at WGU, how we're thinking about WGU making sure that it serves as this sort of institution of last resort in places where teaching apprenticeships aren't available. And we think about it as apprenticeship light versus apprenticeship proper. Like we're still working on this journey ourselves. And everyone is. And what I've really appreciated about this space is there's no such thing as an incumbent. It's new. None of us are like the old hands versus the new kids on the block. Anyone who tells you they've got it figured out is full of shit. And so there's this really nice opportunity to sit around and I have really enjoyed how open-handed and honest the space is about what's working, what's not, and sharing best practices.
Awesome. I love this. In my mind, this is such a no-brainer. I've shared with you, Mallory, in the past. We did a version of this at Rocky Mountain Prep out of necessity because we needed to, and because the most talented people in our building wanted to take on more and do more. And where are we today in scale? I know we're pretty nascent. Where could we be, and where do you see this going? And what are the biggest barriers to scale?
Yeah. So, okay, we're growing really quickly and there's still a lot of ground to cover. So some stats in support of that. I have this like lovely email that I keep framed up on my wall from 2020 when I reached out to a funder who supported us, who had contacts in the Department of Labor, to say, hey, we're working on this thing called apprenticeship degrees. I'd love their advice as we're trying to crack the nut on all things apprenticeship that I don't understand. And it was this very snarky reply of there's no such thing as an apprenticeship degree. They can't call themselves that. Tell them to lose this email and to just stop talking about this. And then 2 years later, in 2022, Tennessee was the state that broke it open, but it had existed in something, these sort of like Byzantine structures called SAA versus OA, like New York had dabbled with it, et cetera. But Tennessee really broke it open in 2022, where there was a joint announcement between the Secretary of Labor, Secretary of Ed, and then First Lady Jill Biden all coming together to say, we want to see teaching apprentices in all 50 states, and we think this can happen. Flash forward today, 47 out of 50 states have at least one teaching apprenticeship program set up in their state. We have had 5,000 learners trained at some point or another on the craft system through one of these 20 institutions, and we know that's just a drop in the bucket. There are tens of thousands of people going through these pathways. That's really heartening. On the other hand, in terms of how far we have to get, I think about three ways in which we are still falling short. One is general, like macroeconomic outcomes. There are still 50,000 teacher vacancies in the United States and closer to 300,000, like 50,000, just there's no teacher there. There's 300,000 positions on top of that where people are not appropriately credentialed, they're out of subject area, there should be someone in that classroom, but they're combining subjects because they don't have a person, etc. So when teaching apprenticeships reach their full potential, that won't exist. There will not be structural vacancies, and we're clearly still a very, very long ways away from that. I think the second way that we're really failing is when we think about the sustainability piece of this. Very few, I only know a few states that are successfully doing that fund braiding I mentioned up front of Pell plus WIOA.
Yep.
And if you don't get that right, I actually do worry about the long-term viability of this to not just be a flash in the pan. Institutions need to get their costs down, and then we need to braid revenue together. And if we don't get that right, this will become an expensive, if promising, but infeasibly expensive initiative. So that's the second piece. The third piece that I always say for last, because I think it's the most important one, is we've got to get serious about teacher quality. When we're talking about this work, we are pushing really hard on this idea of learning happens through doing. We believe educators, we must believe that for our educators, but it's also not the Wild West, right? We can't just use apprenticeships as an excuse to put someone in a classroom who has no experience, no business being there, and no support to get better, and just say like, oh, it's an apprenticeship and call it that.
Yep.
And so I think that third piece where there's still a long ways to go is how do we create systems that are lightweight, that do not hinder innovation, and still foster transparency and accountability on the quality of the programming and the outcomes we're getting.
Nice. Can you, totally resonates. Can you just double click on the WIOA plus the Pell and make sure everyone in the room is following what that means and how to get there?
Oh man, this is everyone's favorite topic on earth. I don't get invited to dinner parties because everyone's favorite thing on earth, I'm sure, is to talk about braiding federal sources of
This is the right dinner party for that conversation.
This is it. This is going to be the only party I get invited to all year. Sylvia, to your question, there's a couple of states, like Mississippi is one, Idaho is one that's knocking on the doorstep, but not quite there. And then the third one I'm blanking on, but I'll go pull the name and bring it back in. But they're working on it. It's not like they're holdouts. It's just they want to make sure they're thinking about it the right way. From there and going into this idea of how do you braid these funds together? I might pull up in a second a visual that I use to show why this is so hard to do when conceptually, see, Catherine, when conceptually, like it makes so much sense. So let's start with conceptually what it is, and then I'll show, I might pull up, if I can multitask, a picture of what this actually looks like and why it's so complicated.
Absolutely.
So Pell, I think everyone here is pretty familiar with. If you are a low-income student, you should be eligible for up to $7,000 a year in Pell funding to offset the cost of tuition. Now, that is usually not enough to cover the full cost of tuition for the full 4 years, and certainly not if you've already exhausted Pell somewhere else, if you're only getting partial Pell, or if you're someone who, like, for example, in California, cost of living is super high, Pell is not adjusted for that. And it's just not enough. So there's some big shortcomings where Pell is unto itself not enough to solve the problem. And it is illegal. It is highly illegal to sort of dilute Pell funds across learners, right? You can't use one learner's funds to offset another. So there's got to be another source of funding. Enter WIOA funding. So WIOA stands for Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act. It is run through the U.S. Department of Labor. It is responsible for disbursing about $3 to $4 billion a year in funding. When it is braided together effectively, and I'll get to why effective is really hard. And Liz, I can see us talking about this credential, like dinner party topics, like please chime in, and anyone else who's in the know, please chime in. When it is brought in, it is brought in as that sort of last dollar where you first exhaust all of your other resources like Pell, like state grants, et cetera. And then WIOA exists to supplement, not supplant, and to cover that last dollar and that last mile cost. And it can be really flexible in how much it's for. What's also really nice about it is it covers more than just tuition. So it can cover things like a stipend for the mentor teacher. Workforce boards can provide wraparound services to an individual who maybe needs bus vouchers or gas vouchers, or needs to be connected to SNAP or TANF or other resources as they go through this journey. Workforce boards provide those last mile supports and do a great job. My colleague Melanie Flowers is here from the craft team. She actually is the treasurer for the National Association of Workforce Boards and used to run her Austin workforce board region. So she's definitely more expert than I am. But that's the idea here is you can braid together Pell and other state resources with this last mile intervention through Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act funding. When it happens, and it's great. The challenge, generally speaking, and I'll turn it over to others while I go get the visual and show it, is that you have qualified apprenticeship degrees reporting up to their state credentialing boards and to their regional and programmatic accreditors that all run on one operating system, right? They're like Linux. And then you've got over here WIOA and workforce boards and Pearl reports reporting up into the Department of Labor, and they're like, I don't know, PCs, or they're like Windows or Mac OS, right? So they're completely different operating systems that don't talk to one another. And especially when you then take a look at the fact that if you're someone like Liz over at Colorado Mountain College, or WGU, which is in 1 in 3 school districts in America, or Reach or whomever else, you start looking at this world where you're like, okay, I am managing 2 different operating systems for thousands of students in thousands of school districts, all of which roll up to different regionals that they have needs on, and are a part of 584 different workforce boards that all might have slightly different ways of doing it. And so the de facto implementation of that gets overwhelming and unruly and leads to people not doing it. And that, as a spoiler, is why we started Craft. It started as Reach house tool for doing that braiding ourselves. And now that is Craft's job as sort of a nonprofit standalone division of WGU, is to help anyone do that in teaching, but also in nursing, social work, etc.
Very helpful. Liz, did you want to build off of that?
I think Mallory crushed it on explaining braiding. I only added stackable credentials because that's fun to talk about as well. But I would say, she's right on the first in and last out. But I will say this about WIOA, because every state is different. And here in Colorado, it's very locally controlled. So you add a level of complexity to it where now it's not just you're going to your state WIOA board and asking for funds. You're going to your local county WIOA offices, which could be a closet somewhere in that county, and asking to assist your students. So it really does behoove you to understand how WIOA works in your state and how to access those dollars. And then, the other thing too is when Mallory touched on sustainability and reducing costs in higher education is a big component. The other thing too is some states who are passing legislation on registered apprenticeships have fiscal notes attached to it, which is great. Ours did not in Colorado. So we landed a grant elsewhere to help us plan to put this in place, but we did not leverage any funding for teacher apprenticeship. And so that's good and bad in the sense that we're not dependent on that funding for sustainability. We're working it through just like Mallory described. But it was also kind of a bummer as well, because there are sources of funding that our apprentices can tap into based on how they're working in their districts. But it is very complicated. So she's right. But it's fascinating to study what is out there and to fully get college paid for apprentices.
And James, this is that visual of this is one example that we did this is for the state of Oklahoma. But imagine this flow of data. Each arrow represents a different type of report that needs to get sent.
Yep.
And collectively, we end up talking about over 500 variables here that need to get reported every single quarter. So imagine this copied and pasted every single quarter. And then imagine it sort of stacked outwards on top of itself. This represents the case of one teacher training program working with one RAP sponsor with one district and one apprentice inside of one workforce board region. If any of those things changes, you then have to have that data parsed in a way where it can be separated and peeled off and sorted elsewhere.
Yep.
And so what Liz is talking about of that complexity on that funding, a lot of times groups just look around and like, it's costing us more to figure out how to get a hold of this funding than we're actually making off of it, and we're losing funds. And so that's the issue we're trying to solve. The second piece I'll say to Liz's part around stackability, I do think is the other side of this, because if we're serious about economic mobility for folks, and this is a pathway that I just use as a rough hewn example, but a lot of times the challenge for people who don't persist is, hey, I hear you that in 4 years I'll make more money. I've got a kid who has medical bills today, right? Like I have to buy groceries tonight. And so creating these stackable pathways in which I first get my foot in the door, maybe out of high school if I'm a teenager, or maybe as an adult, wherever I am on the journey, I can get that first credential with a couple of months of training, right? As a certified nursing assistant in healthcare, as a paraprofessional in K-12. And then I can be at any given time a year away or less from my next pay bump. And it keeps stacking and it builds, but I don't have to wait. It's not all or nothing for me to get credentials and funding for the work I'm doing.
That's a great segue. Both a lot of directions to go from here, but let me check one thing with you. You might know this, or Liz or someone in the room might know this. I read somewhere that the average WIOA grant recipient gets 2.5 or 3 workforce training stipends funded. Is that accurate?
Yes.
I've looked at the other end of the data, which is the 78,000 different provider list of the federal government WIOA training list provider, which is quite a mess. It is a tough, obviously a lot of work needs to be done, and a lot of institutions need your help and Craft's help to navigate how to braid those funding streams together. Going back or thinking about that slide you just presented, the work I think about every day is how do we help students and young people and the people who care about them, love them, and support them in figuring out their journeys next after high school. How do we help make the best pathways and the programs that are going to lead to economic and social mobility available to them and something they're thinking about? How do you think about the demand side of this equation?
I think about it as rungs on a ladder, and I think about it as paradoxically being employer driven. And I am so serious about like learners having economic mobility is my North Star. And so it sounds paradoxical when then I say, and so my focus is employers. But my experience has been if we're going to get adoption at scale, and that is Craft's big, hairy goal, right? Like the thing that I report out to our board and our funders on is this 10 million number. There are 10 million skilled labor vacancies in the United States right now. Sometimes it's a little more, sometimes a little less, but around 10 million. That number should not exist. If you've got 50 to 60 million working adults talking about how they wish they had training to be moving up higher in their career ladders, and you've got employers saying that like for every 5 or 6 of those, they have a job that they want one of them to fill. And a lot of times those frontline folks are working in their same company. That's just dead weight loss inside of the economy. But we can't make that problem resolve itself at scale if we ask for companies to behave differently than a company's mandate is to behave. And so the way I think about it is, how do you create rungs that are a win-win for both the employer and the individual? Not because I care about them equally, to be honest, I don't, but because if you don't tend to both of them equally, it is going to be the learner who loses out. And so the way that we think about that is helping employers think through those rungs on a ladder, right? Like, what is your first frontline job that usually your big issue is churn, right? And when we talk with groups, like I know Chelsea in here, Chelsea, I might pick on you, like you can speak to these numbers really well. Like employers know dead to rights what it costs them when a frontline worker turns over every on average 9 months versus 12 months. Like they know those numbers. And Chelsea Miller, please jump in and like weigh in on that. Because we start with that value proposition of like, what if your paras, what if your cashiers, what if your certified nursing assistants lasted for 12 months instead of 9 months, right? How much money would that save you? And what if at the end of those 12 months, instead of them leaving, what if what they did was they moved up into that next role for you that you have a harder time skilling because it requires someone within your local vicinity to have that exact credential or skill set you need. And yes, it'll open up a new vacancy, but you can attract better talent to it because of the promise of that upward mobility.
Yep.
And so that's how we think about it, is ladder rungs that are close enough together that someone can actually climb them without having to take big leaps and risks, and helping employers build those ladder rungs because it's good business for them along the way. Chelsea, do you have any thoughts on this as the expert in the room on this? I might have put her on the spot and she stepped away. So there you go. I like to put people on the spot. When she comes back, she can weigh in.
Nice. That makes sense to me. A lot of good folks from Denver Health in our networks. Last I checked, they had 2,500 openings on a staff of 9,500.
Mhm.
And it's like, what's the plan here, guys? What are you gonna do?
That's right.
And they're vast majority entry level. And then when I worked with them and or talked to them about it and tried to understand it, it was like, well, all the training providers are onesie twosies, and we can't. None of them have the capacity to scale at the level that we need to scale, and so we need to think pretty differently about how we solve that problem.
That's right. And like Liz is putting these stats in the chat, and I mean, the numbers are astounding. The impact it has on employers when they can't fill these spots or when they turn over and have to fill them like midstream. And so there's a real value proposition here for those folks. And like you said, businesses have a core business that is not trying to stitch all of this together. And so one
Hmm.
of the things that Craft is trying to do is, yes, automate the compliance reporting, right? We
Yep.
call ourselves like TurboTax for apprenticeship degrees, but also just thinking about in general, how do you create one front door for an employer,
Yep.
right? So if you are DaVita or you are Intermountain Health, you don't have to go and manage 100 different workforce boards and 20 different college partners
Yep.
to manage all of these different things. Like you can go in, enter the zip codes where you are, and just like we're not here yet, but this is what we're building towards, is going
Yep.
beyond compliance to Craft being the free front door for accessing these groups that want to find you, and that need to be able to split off pieces of your work here and there, right? Like this workforce board, this wrap sponsor, et cetera, without the employer needing to suddenly manage 1,000 new community partners.
Yep. 100%. That makes sense. So, not letting you off the hook, and then we'll open it up to questions. But a lot of great K-12 leaders here in the room, including friendship folks. Um, Obviously, I spent a lot of time on the K-12 side. What do you think is needed for K-12 and navigation and the educators working with high schoolers to prepare them to find great opportunities?
I have a controversial take on this one,
Great.
which
Love
is
it.
we coddle the hell out of high school students.
Yep.
And the net result is that it hurts them because employers do not believe that these individuals are going to show up on time, that they're going to show up and be unplugged from their phones,
Yep.
and that they're going to do this work, right? I'm not even talking about academic content. I'm talking about I'm going to show up and not be a liability.
Yep.
And so the thing that we need to start with is this idea of education is not the preparation of life, but the living of life itself, right? As the adage goes, like we need these students to be getting real world exposure. Like Michael Horn has this quote of CTE for all that I ardently agree with.
Hmm.
Every single student should be having real world experiences in high school, and critically important, they should be able to be fired from those experiences, right? If
Hmm.
you show up late, if you don't do what you're supposed to be doing, employers should have the right to get you out of there the same way that they would. Like that's the learning experience. The learning experience is not the third or fourth or fifth chance. The learning experience is getting fired and having to go back and sit in a classroom while the rest of your colleagues and friends are getting paid to go be off campus exploring what they like to do. So I think that is actually the easiest low-hanging fruit, but it's actually very hard because again, for good reason, there are things like safeguarding for children and there are restorative practices. And I believe in all of that. I do worry that we've run into this space where it prevents us from being able to have accountability for our young people, and who that ultimately hurts the most are those young people when they try to go find their way into the workforce.
Love it. Good take. I like that. A lot of my colleagues and friends in K-12 are reading Jonathan Haidt's book, Coddling of the American Mind, and thinking about the implications, which are tangential to that point. I've got one more question, and then we'll open it up. I want to address the elephant in the Trump or the Musk in the room. What is your take? This is a safe, quiet space. I'm going to put it on YouTube for anyone to view. But what is the bear case and the bull case for what could happen in this next administration?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not going to put my cards close to the chest. I think we're looking at a lot more of the bear cases than the bull cases right now. This morning, a bunch of higher ed received notifications that in the teacher prep space that their TQP and seed grants had been canceled. We're seeing all of these other things get in the way that are, quite frankly, from a sheer economic perspective. And I say this as someone who people can probably get the sense like I'm not a touchy-feely. I like this is going to be economically disastrous for economic mobility and for workforce, which is in a white collar economy foundational to American prosperity, right? So I think our bear case that I am bracing for is going to be that we see over the next few years things that cut into muscle and cut out investments in the infrastructure that we need, or even if they don't, create so much instability and uncertainty that people stop doing that. And that then the winners will be people like Liz who have figured out how to do this without a lot of federal funding of any kind, right? And who have not even assumed that that's going to be a possibility.
Mhm.
So that's the bear market, and that's going to reward people who figure out how to do this for dirt cheap, right? I'm not talking about $8,000 or less a year. I'm talking about $2,000 or less a year. Those will be the winners in that case. I think if we were to look at a bear market, here is the good news is so far of all of the things that there seems to be a lot of rancor over, even if WIOA is being questioned for its efficacy, I am not hearing any talks about cutting the overall amount of funding for workforce. I'm hearing quite the opposite, right? That we need to be investing more in workforce. We need to be moving CTE and apprenticeship together under the same division, and we need to be funding both more extensively.
Yep.
I think there's a real chance that that happens. And then the question will be, how do we make sure, in that case, how do we make sure that it doesn't just reward people who are really good at sucking up federal dollars? How do we make sure that there's again, it comes back to this accountability and transparency. How do we make sure that those dollars are being used to not just produce more fat in the system, but to actually like beef up the muscle of this infrastructure? So I think that's the big question right now.
Awesome. Okay, let's open it up.
While people think about their questions, and I'm a big fan of the teacher weight, so I'll do that.
So
And
I'll ask you a question, Mallory. Your
Go
colleague
ahead,
said it
Kim.
to you because I think it's something that's been on my mind really heavily lately. What do you see as the role that, for example, the professional boards like teaching state level teacher education boards and nursing boards have in perpetuating a system that is very unfriendly to any kind of apprenticeship system and making it, I think, very difficult for teacher prep programs to both satisfy the board and to offer anything that's not the traditional, you have to live at school full time and do a teacher prep program that's going to take you 5 years model.
I think it's a huge problem. So I think that if there was any good to come out of this chaos, I would love to see that these credentialing boards have to accept like a common application, basically, right? Of if you meet these threshold criteria, it is astounding to me, this idea that an institution can get regional and programmatic accreditation, and then an accreditor can still come in and refuse to grant seats in that state. That is nonsense. That is political nonsense, and it happens all the time. And so we are seeing that right now in teaching and nursing in particular. But I think anywhere you have professional certification, there's going to be a power struggle. And one of the things that I hope governors and others will do is to start putting pressure on these groups of, look, we're not talking about lowering quality. Again, we're not talking about passing groups through that have lower outputs and outcomes, but letting go of this input idea of like number of hours spent on campus, like things like that are going to somehow be a better predictor of outcomes when empirically they've not demonstrated that, is something that we've got to figure out. We've got to figure out how to either eliminate those groups and just rely on regional and programmatic accreditation plus Praxis or NCLEX passage rates, or we've got to figure out how to streamline them and make them more efficient. I see Woo.
My
Yeah, go
not
ahead.
very My observation is that most of these entry-level licensing boards are cartels for established interest and like whoever the biggest interests are in that community. Has that been your experience?
Absolutely. Yes. Which I realize is an unpopular thing to say as I sit inside of institutions that have credentialing relationships with all of those different partners. But it's true. Like I absolutely think that you have regional and programmatic accreditation. The idea that on top of that you have to have state licensure to somehow safeguard safety is bullshit. It's absolute nonsense.
And it hurts a lot of low-income individuals trying to get into good jobs and good pathways. Brett, I see your hand raised.
Hello from Friendship. Um, Thank you, Mallory, for this. It's just been really great to listen and hear. And I guess my question is more from the practitioner point of view, in terms of like if you could suggest high schools that are like doing apprenticeships, but like want to open it to the more of our students to have this experience and our alumni as well. What would be like the first step that you want to make sure that everyone, like the students are like exploring, or kind of like what the first step could be? Does that
Go
make
call
sense?
and it's a great question. And my
Okay.
first step would be one phone call to one group, and then my second one would be a phone call to a second group.
Okay.
So the first phone call would be to my local U.S. Chamber of or my local Chamber of Commerce, right? To have them come in and bring employers to and have them look around and say, hey, here is sort of like the profile of our students. Here's where we're based. Here, our geographies, our zip codes. What are the jobs that you need that we should be preparing them for? And in what ways can we borrow from you the trainings you provide so that they're coming in with your exact industry standards? That would be thing number one. Thing number two is I would go over to my local workforce board and I would tell them I'm open for business and invite them to come onto my campus, not just once, but like once a week. Workforce boards are not legally allowed to use their WIOA funding for recruitment and outreach. Like they can't go do media and advertising. So they've got all of these dollars and they've got all of these people they could serve, but they're not allowed to spend their money letting those people know they exist. I had no idea workforce boards existed until I was 37 years old, right? And so I think, and most kids don't either, and they certainly don't know what resources are available. And so, Brett, those would be my first two phone calls to first find out what does the industry need, and then have workforce boards come in and figure out how can we fund and support those transitions into those pathways.
Awesome. I also see Woo, your hand.
Mallory, it was a great. Before this meeting, my knowledge on the apprenticeships degree program was like a zero. I feel like now I have like a 3% understanding.
You're higher than me then, Woo.
Yeah. So question. So I work in a traditional STEM university in New Jersey. But I wanted to learn. So how is AI is shaping your area or expected to shape your area?
So we are right in the middle of a massive raise for AI overhauling of all of this. So I think about it. I'm going to give just three examples because they're the three most prescient ones, but I think of AI as overhauling any system. Like if you can't list for me 10 things that are going to change in your industry because of AI, you're not thinking hard enough, is my general philosophy. So here's the big three for us. For me, it's first about matching like employer skill fits. And I'll go into each of these more in a second. So like job description and like employer skill fits would be the first one. Second would be like validation of those skills, right? Making sure you have them or you don't. And then the third would be in the case that you don't have them and need the training, creating customized, tailored content through AI. So let's go into each of those. Right now, like employers will have all of these job postings that are in no way attached, like the skills listed in there are in no way attached to the training that is happening at the local institution. And so first doing AI matching of a student is taking your supply chain management major. Let's take a look at all of the job descriptions out there from the 200 companies that any of our students have gone to in the last 5 years. And let's use AI to scrape all of those job descriptions, parse all of the skills outlined there, and then do like a crosswalk with our student learning outcomes, course learning outcomes, and program outcomes to take a look at like, what is the percent match, and where there's a mismatch, what do we need to backfill and how? So that's the first thing, is like using it to make sure that our content is staying up to date with that it's not a Venn diagram. It's a perfect overlap between what employers are putting on their skill requirements and what we're training students to do. That's the first example I think of. The second piece I think of is great. So now, I always talk about how on LinkedIn, for all you know, I speak Russian, right? Like, because I said so, right? I speak Russian because I've said so on LinkedIn. I don't actually at all, but you would have no way of knowing that. It's all self-attested. So I think the second question in AI is, how can we use AI to get really good at providing third-party attestation of those skills, right? Mallory says she can speak Russian. How do I know if that's true? And if it's true, how true it is? And in what ways does that align with the level of importance that has for you as an employer that's listed that as a required skill? So that's the second piece, is skill validation against that job profile. The third thing that I think about is, okay, so Mallory doesn't have a skill she needs. How do we break down, like the analogy that I've heard that I like the most is this idea of currency, of like if an entire degree is $100 bill, how do I make change, right? Like if I'm an institution and someone already has 85 cents on the dollar of what's required here, how do I get them content for the exact 15 cents left that they need and make that exact change? Understanding that every student is going to be different and that we have to have something that is going to take their needs and produce content and training and support for them based on their exact gaps, based on their learning needs, et cetera. And so those are just the first three examples, but I think AI, what it has the potential to do broadly speaking in the economic mobility and upskilling space, is to create the connective bridge between learners and employers, and then where there is a gap, to create the rungs in the ladder that span that bridge.
So how many years would you give to having some kind of a personal AI agent, individualized AI agent that can do three things that you just talked about?
Well, I'm going to give Craft 2 years, and I'm going to hope someone beats me to it and makes my team run faster.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Angela, see you've got a question in the chat here. You want to come off mute and ask?
Sure, and I think it matches with what Sylvia's asking too. Is there an entry level point if I have a parent on my caseload, I work for a mentoring program who says, hey, I'd love to do this path, like, and they can find these opportunities? Or is the whole point, like, you kind of have to already be in a school that's offering it, being a para, working in an environment where there's already relationships? So I guess, can people choose this path and like get into it, or do they have to kind of be in the right place, right time of somewhere that's offering it and they're identified as a good candidate?
The stage we're in right now is that this is still a B2B2C story, which means that we have to be working with an employer who says, I've got these spots, and then they're upskilling an individual. Now, the shortcut, Angela, in the near term is take that individual over to a local workforce board and ask that workforce board, who do you already have that B2B partnership with, right? Like, who are the employers that are hiring and doing these apprenticeship pathways, and how do we get them plugged in? So that would be my workaround in your seat. We need better tools in this space that don't require you to go to the workforce board, but that would be my recommendation today, is look up, like, again, using the powers of AI, you can go into Google and ask, like, where's my local workforce board and how do I get in touch? And they will AI generate for you what those results are. I would call them and I would take your parent over and find out who the employers are that are trying to match with people in their community.
Angela's, I think we're doing a lot of that mapping, but it's not comprehensive at this point. And so I'm taking the workforce board note down myself, because we're supporting nonprofits and high schools with helping their students find these great opportunities and next steps. Well,
Thanks.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I just said thanks.
We are at time. I really, really want to thank you, Mallory. This has been a joy and a lot of fun. I've been hosting these purposeful pathway conversations to talk about the most exciting trends in economic and social mobility in our country. And I can't think of a better one than apprenticeship degrees and the work that you're leading and doing. And so I'm so grateful that we got to spend time going deep with you.
James, thank you so much for having me. And I see Sylvia's question, so I might, for anyone who's got 2 minutes, stay on to answer her question. And then Danny had the request that we share materials, which, James, I'll give to you.
I'm on that. Yep. I got you, Danny.
Anyone and everyone. So thanks for everyone who's going to hop. And if you've got a minute, I would love to stay and chat, Sylvia, about your two questions. So without further ado, really quickly, I think about it at three levels. So Sylvia's first question was, how do I find out who's doing this in California? And then the second was, how is this different from the co-op world? So that first one of how is this, like, how do I find out in any state, whether it's California or anyone else? The first thing I would do is go look up your state's what's called an eligible training provider list, the ETPL. Those are groups that have received authorization to access WIOA funds in your state. So look for like university names or other groups in there, and that's how you will know if they're on that list that they're probably set up for business here. That's the easiest way to do it in California, anywhere else. If you're looking for California, what I can promise you is that if you get in touch with me, I will connect you to a couple of different institutions, WGU being one, Reach University being another, and then a few others that I know are playing in this. And I always love putting people in touch so that they can decide what's the best university for them. So that's the first question. To the second of how is this different from a co-op? And I think a lot of times Northeastern gets held up as that example, and it's great work. But let's talk about how it's different through the lens of those 5 pillars, right? So first, efficiency. You are not, as a co-op, going and getting 50% of your credits over the course of a 4-year degree for a co-op. You go and do like a couple, like a semester long, maybe a full year at most internship. So that's the first piece. From there, like flexibility, it's still expected that, school is fitting around the job and that it's the short-term stint and that you'll like do it for a little bit and then you'll leave. Relevance, there's usually not a direct curricular ties between what your economics professor is teaching you in the fall versus then what you're going and doing for Accenture accounting in the spring. There's no connection between those ones. Affordability. So you're still paying the full sticker price of tuition, which at, Northeastern is something like $80,000 a year. And then the fifth one of professional capital, it can lead to a job, but usually it doesn't, right? The idea is like, I'm an intern, I'm going to go do this for a semester. There's no promise whatsoever that you have a job waiting for you on the other side. And so I think about that as like, I'm not saying a co-op is bad. I think we need a diverse landscape, and there will be many kids for whom the co-op in a traditional college experience is exactly what they need. But I think about those 5 pillars of what makes an apprenticeship degree as the things that define that distinguish it from a co-op experience.
Mallory, have you seen the Harvard Workforce Almanac work?
Oh,
It's from the Harvard Workforce Project. We've got a partnership with them, and it's a more user-friendly version of the ITPL and WIOA training list that has a little bit more data on it.
well, Joe Fuller from the Harvard Workforce Center is my board chair, so I'm embarrassed I didn't know about that.
Okay,
And
well, happy to make
now
the
I'll pretend like I did the next time I talk to them.
Yes, exactly. No, it's a helpful way to start to make that a little more user-friendly.
I love it. Thank you.
Yes. Well, thank you again. Appreciate it. Thanks everyone who was able to join us, and I'll send a wrap up likely early next week.
Perfect. Thanks all.
Cool. Thanks, Mallory. Great to see you.
Good to see you. Bye.